My name was Amanda Hale. I was 42 years old when I found myself inside a concrete box with no windows and no sounds. 1 hour a day, a shower. The rest, cement, silence, and thoughts. I talked to myself, drew on the wall with my finger, remembered the smells of the past. It wasn't loneliness that threatened me. It was my own mind. But the worst part wasn't fear. The worst part was that I began to find meaning in it. And this is my story. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name was Amanda Hale. I was 42 years old, and until the moment that steel door shut behind me, I had been an accountant in Portland, Oregon. Not a particularly remarkable one, but meticulous, punctual, and obsessed with order. My world had always been numbers, ledgers, and quiet Sunday mornings with a black coffee and the rustle of spreadsheets. I thought I understood silence, but I didn't. Not until I was locked inside that cement box, where time evaporated and thought became sound. The cell measured 6.5 by 9 feet. The concrete was raw, unfinished, and cold enough to steal the warmth from your bones. There were no windows, no bars, just a solid door with a metal slot that opened from the outside. That first night, I realized that everything I had ever associated with the word room no longer applied. This wasn't a room. It was a container for someone who was no longer considered a person. Above me, in the center of the ceiling, a single fluorescent light buzzed without rhythm. It didn't flicker like they do in horror films. No, it hummed, a deep, constant tone like the inside of a dying refrigerator. The sound sank into my skull. I began to imagine it forming cracks along the bones of my forehead, as though the noise itself was trying to carve a way into my thoughts. I tried to block it out by breathing, counting the seconds between each inhale and exhale, but the sound would always catch up, overtaking my pulse, flattening my heartbeat into its droning monotony. There was a stainless steel toilet in the corner, bolted to the floor like an anchor in an ocean of gray. Next to it, a sink that only spat water for 5 seconds at a time when I pressed the cold, stiff button. No mirror, no shelf, no soap, just water, metal, and my own reflection in the warped steel if I leaned close enough. What I saw that first night was not myself. It was a distortion, skin stretched by stress, eyes diluted by fluorescent white, hair limp and directionless, a face smudged out of focus. They gave me a thin blue mat, not even half an inch thick. I laid it on the floor and curled into it, but the cold seeped through instantly. There were no blankets, no pillow. I folded my jumpsuit beneath my head and tried to imagine it was soft. It wasn't. The cement drank all warmth. I felt as though I was lying directly on the bones of the earth. I didn't sleep. I listened. I listened to everything and nothing. The shift of the metal door slot, opening for inspections every 15 minutes. The occasional flush from another cell, echoing through the pipes like distant thunder. But mostly it was the light, that sound it made. It began to feel less like a noise and more like a presence, like something sentient above me, watching, pressing down. I wondered if anyone else could hear it like I did, if the buzzing would ever stop, if it had always been there in my life, unnoticed, waiting. In the absence of time, I became obsessed with tiny things. The texture of the cement, the way my breath left a faint mist on the steel toilet in the morning, the pattern of hair follicles on the inside of my arm. I started cataloging them like I used to log receipts. Day 1, 3 lines in the concrete near the left wall. Day 2, small stain near the base of the door that resembled a comma. There were no clocks, no windows, no sun. Only these markers, these inventions of time to reassure myself that I was still existing in something sequential. I thought about my hands. I stared at them, palms open, trying to remember how they used to move, how they once danced over keyboards, scribbled notes in planners, held cups, faces, keys. Now they just sat, limp on my knees, or clasped together, cold and still. They looked older in that light. I rubbed my thumb across the callus on my middle finger, left there from years of holding pens. It reminded me that I had written once, that I had told the world what I thought, that I had been listened to. But in here, words had no purpose. There was no one to hear them. My voice, unused, felt fragile, like something I could break if I dared speak too loudly. On that first morning, or what I assumed was morning, I whispered my name just to test it, just to hear something human. The sound disappeared into the cement like a secret swallowed by the walls. I remember kneeling at the far corner of the cell, pressing my fingertips against the floor, hoping to feel some vibration, something beyond myself. There was none. The concrete was mute. I leaned forward until my forehead touched it and stayed like that, breathing in the scent of dust, mildew, and something sour that lived in the pores of the room. I began to realize how loud memory could be when everything else was quiet. Faces appeared. My sister's laugh, bright and clipped like clinking ice. The taste of birthday cake frosting from when I turned 8. My father's brown leather shoes and the creak they made on the front porch. These things didn't come gently. They rushed in, flooding the space like a breached dam, overwhelming me. I wanted them and hated them. They were too vivid, too unreachable. They reminded me that I wasn't made for silence. I had been built in noise. Now I was disassembling. That first day stretched endlessly. The concept of time dissolved. My body didn't know when to sleep, when to eat. Hunger came and went like weather. The tray slot opened once, dry meat, 2 slices of bread, lukewarm water. I ate without tasting, not because I wasn't hungry, but because I didn't want to feel anything that connected me to the outside. Food was from there. I was here. When the light dimmed slightly, only barely perceptible, I told myself it was night. I curled again on the mat, but this time I didn't try to sleep. I just laid still and listened to my own breathing. I focused on the rise and fall of my chest, counting as high as I could before forgetting the number, then starting over. That was how I measured hours, by losing count of them. Somewhere in that first night, I accepted something terrifying, that this place wasn't trying to break me. It was trying to erase me, not with cruelty, but with stillness, with sameness, with the dull repetition of nothing. And I was afraid that if I didn't resist, I would become like the walls, gray, silent, and without edges. I didn't cry, not because I was strong, but because tears require a kind of release I wasn't ready to surrender to. Crying would make it real. So I clenched my hands and pressed my back against the wall and told myself stories. I described the last sunrise I had seen. I listed my favorite scents: cinnamon, gasoline, the pages of new books. I tried to remember the lyrics to a song I used to hum in the car on the way to work. I got to the chorus and couldn't finish it. I stared at the light. It stared back. And we stayed like that until sleep came like an animal, slow, creeping and uninvited. That was day one. At least I think it was. There was no way to be sure anymore. I began to count things I couldn't see, sounds behind the walls, cracks in the cement that I was sure had grown longer, darker, my own thoughts, multiplying like mold spores in a sealed jar. The light overhead still buzzed without mercy, though now I noticed its pitch would sometimes dip ever so slightly, like a throat clearing itself of guilt. I wondered if the light was alive. By then, I had lost the ability to tell how many days I'd spent in the cell. My body no longer trusted hunger as a guide. Time came in textures now. The rough grit of cement beneath my fingertips, the occasional slickness of condensation from the sink, the thin layer of oil my skin left on the metal door after I leaned against it too long. I stopped dreaming, or if I did, I couldn't separate dreams from memory. It was during what I assumed to be the third or fourth morning that I first noticed the shadow. It lived just beneath the sink, right where the pipe met the wall. There was no logical way for a shadow to exist there. The overhead light was too flat, too direct. The walls were too uniform in tone. But there it was, an uneven darkness, no larger than a coin at first, more of a smudge than a shape. I thought it was my eyes adjusting poorly, the way they sometimes do when everything is the same color for too long. But the shadow stayed. I lay on my mat and stared at it for hours. My eyes began to ache from the strain, the muscles behind them twitching from the constant focus. But the shadow held. It did not blur or disappear when I blinked. I moved my head to different angles, stood, crouched, even leaned against the opposite wall to observe it from afar. It remained in place, untouched by my movements. That was when I realized it wasn't reacting to the light. It was reacting to me. Every time I looked away, the feeling intensified. A pressure behind my ribs, a knot in my stomach that refused to dissolve. The air seemed thicker near that part of the room, as if the molecules had decided to gather there, pressing in around the shadow like silent conspirators. I spoke no words. I had long since given up trying to use my voice, but I did reach out, one trembling hand inching toward the sink, fingers extended like antennae. The metal was as cold as ever, the pipe firm. But when my fingertip hovered just above the shadow, the cold deepened. It felt like the air had been sucked from the space between skin and wall, like there was a hole in the world. I pulled back. The next time I looked, the shadow had grown, only slightly, but enough that I could see a tail forming, no longer a circle, but a kind of hooked comma. I laughed without sound, a shadow with grammar. My mind had officially begun its descent, but even that thought didn't frighten me as much as it should have. There was comfort in structure, even if it was madness. I remembered a documentary I'd once watched about prisoners in solitary who saw things, faces in peeling paint, insects crawling up invisible chains, lights that spelled messages. I'd pitied them, thought myself above that kind of mental decay. But the mind is not a fortress. It is a sponge, and in solitude, it soaks up whatever it can find, even hallucinations, especially hallucinations. On the fifth or sixth day, I had lost count entirely by then, I noticed that the shadow no longer stayed still. It flickered, just once. A slight tremor at its edge, like a flag caught in wind I couldn't feel. That night, or what I believed to be night, I did not sleep. I sat against the wall, knees to chest, eyes locked on that dark mark like it was an enemy I had no name for. It began to whisper, not in words, not in voices, but in memory. I remembered the smell of lemon cleaner on my mother's kitchen floor, the click of her heels as she moved across it, carrying a bowl of soup I had refused to eat. I remembered the sting of her hand, the look on her face not of anger, but of disappointment. I remembered the silence that followed, how it had lasted the entire weekend, how even as a child I understood that silence could be punishment, that it could be louder than yelling. The shadow pulsed beneath the sink as if it were breathing with me. Inhale, expand. Exhale, shrink. I tried to close my eyes, but the image of it had burned into the back of my eyelids like a photographic negative. I opened them again, and it was closer. I swore it had moved, just half an inch, toward the edge of the wall. I pressed my back harder into the opposite corner, digging my spine into the concrete to anchor myself to reality. There were no sounds from the corridor that night, no footsteps, no tray slot, just the low hum of electricity and the slow rhythmic beating of my own heart. I began to tap my fingers against the cement floor, just to make a sound, to prove I could. I counted every tap, forcing myself to stay tethered to numbers, to structure, to something familiar. But numbers began to blur. I lost track at 31. Or was it 13? My fingers ached, and my palm was raw. I had scraped skin without knowing it. There were tiny red stains on the floor where I sat. In the morning, the light had not changed, but my body insisted it was morning. I approached the sink. The shadow remained. It had not moved in the night. Or had it? The doubt was corrosive. I crouched low and examined it again. The hook had deepened. It was now shaped like a question mark, and I had no answer. I pressed my forehead to the cool metal of the sink and whispered every name I could remember. Friends, co-workers, a barista I used to see every Friday. I tried to anchor myself to them, to remind myself that I had existed among people once, that I had spoken, touched, smiled, but their names sounded foreign now, like lines from a play I had forgotten I was in. Eventually, I sat back and laughed. No sound, just air expelled through clenched teeth. The shadow had not come to haunt me. I had summoned it. It was not a presence. It was a mirror. It was not trying to escape the wall. It was trying to show me what I had become. And in that stillness, in that impossible darkness beneath the sink, I began to understand the truth of solitary. It does not lock you in. It erases you until you lock yourself out. There came a moment when the dimensions of the cell were no longer abstract to me. I knew them in the bones of my ankles, in the tight pull of my calves, in the ache that bloomed across my lower back like an old bruise. 10 steps long, 3.5 across, measured not with a ruler, but with repetition, ritual, relentlessness. I had become the pendulum of a broken clock, ticking back and forth without progress, circling the same perimeter in my mind and on the concrete floor. I walked to forget I was still. That was the paradox. The more I moved, the less I existed. I erased the edge between myself and the walls, blurred it with every step until I was no longer a woman in a cage, but the cage itself. I imagined myself as dust, as echo, as the faintest outline of breath on a mirror. My feet remembered the rhythm before my mind did. Heel, ball, toe, turn, heel, ball, toe, again. I did not walk for exercise. I walked to remain, because in those 23 hours of isolation, there was no hour more sacred than the one when they allowed me to move. The hour began without ceremony, a click, a metal slide, a brief command I no longer heard as language, but only as permission. I stepped out into a space just barely wider than my cell, surrounded on all sides by blank gray walls so high they swallowed the sky. Above, a mesh ceiling let in filtered daylight, but it offered no warmth. The sun was only a rumor. Some days I saw another woman walking in the space parallel to mine. Our cages were adjacent but divided, side by side like tombstones with breath. We never looked at each other directly. Eye contact felt like cheating, like a rebellion too bold for our circumstances. But I felt her there. The faint tremble of the metal underfoot when she pivoted, the quiet scrape of her shoes mirroring mine. We were dancers without music, each alone in our rotation, bound by invisible choreography. I tried to find patterns in her pace. Sometimes she started fast, then slowed. Other days, she paused abruptly, mid-step, as if a memory had gripped her ankle and wouldn't let go. I began to wonder if she was real. Perhaps she was a fragment of my earlier self, the one who still believed in clocks and conversations. Perhaps I was walking beside my own ghost. Time did strange things in that space. 1 hour felt like both a gasp and a lifetime. I would begin the loop thinking I had just started, then look down and see that my shoes had worn a path in the dirt. Thin lines etched like veins, evidence that I had passed here hundreds of times. There were days I thought I could hear my past steps whispering up from the ground, repeating back the things I had tried to forget. I remembered the hallways of my old office, carpeted, wide, filled with fluorescent lights that hummed without apology. I used to pace there too, back when pacing meant deadlines and nervous anticipation. But those steps had purpose. These were different. These were ceremonial. I was performing a funeral for my former self, one lap at a time. I tried counting the loops, but my mind rebelled. After 27 or 64, who could say? I would lose the thread and start again. The number didn't matter. What mattered was the movement, the act of defiance in not sitting still. Every turn was a small assertion. I am still here. My body still obeys. My legs still know forward, even if there is no destination. Eventually, the thoughts came less often. I began to walk without thinking, existing only in the cadence of limbs and breath. Inhale, step, exhale, turn. The mind softened. The sharp edges dulled. That was the trick of isolation. It wore down thought like water over stone, until all that remained was instinct. One day, in the middle of the hour, I stopped. It was not planned. My foot hovered mid-step, then lowered itself slowly, carefully, as if I had stepped on something alive. The air around me was heavy. I realized I had forgotten my name. It struck me not as terror, but as an odd fact, a blank spot on a form. I could remember the way my name looked on business cards, the font, the crispness of the white paper, but not the actual sound of it in my mouth. I stood there in the enclosure, a woman shaped like silence, and waited to see if the memory would return. It didn't. The guard outside barked something unintelligible. The hour was over. Back inside, the cell felt smaller. My limbs had expanded, grown greedy with motion. Now they folded themselves again into the neat confines of obedience. I sat on the cot and stared at the opposite wall, where a hairline crack ran from floor to ceiling. I traced it with my eyes, over and over, until it became a river, a path, a scar. The hour of circling feet had passed, but its ghost remained. I still felt the rhythm in my muscles, the pressure of the turn in my hip. My shoulders ached with invisible momentum. I wondered how many days it would take before the walk would become a dream and the cell the only truth. In sleep, I walked. I walked through corridors that stretched into darkness. I walked beside women I couldn't see but felt in my ribs. I walked until my feet left the ground, until I was moving without touching anything, until I dissolved into motion itself. And then I woke, back to the stillness, back to the box, back to the crack in the wall that waited for my eyes like a ritual. But I had touched the hour again. I had tasted the shape of outside, even if it was still inside. And as long as I could walk in circles, I told myself, I had not yet become the wall. Not entirely. Not yet. The walls began to breathe. At first, I thought it was just my imagination reacting to the stale air and lack of stimulation. But as the days dragged on in their shapeless way, the surface of the concrete around me no longer seemed inert. It pulsed in my peripheral vision like lungs inflating slowly, exhaling invisibly. The color changed slightly depending on where I sat or stood, gray morphing to yellowish pink, as if some subterranean flesh had begun to press outward from the other side. It wasn't brick anymore. It was tissue. I stared for hours at one particular panel near the bed. A stain had formed there, faint, irregular, shaped like an open palm. It looked as though someone had once reached out and pushed hard, leaving part of themselves behind. I would not have called it a hallucination. Hallucinations were supposed to be explosive, vivid, theatrical. This was more insidious, a whisper of something not meant to be seen, a suggestion, not a performance. I began to sense the presence of skin everywhere. My own first, dry, cracking, tight across my knuckles, as if it too wanted to shed itself and become part of the walls. But then other textures crept into my awareness. The ceiling overhead, usually so flat and uncaring, seemed now to ripple faintly like goosebumps on flesh. The floor, when I pressed my bare feet against it, felt warm in places. I told myself it was my body playing tricks, nerve endings misfiring, imagination rebelling against isolation. But some part of me, the part not ruined yet, knew it was more than that. I was fusing. There's a particular horror in becoming what you fear. I had always imagined confinement as something external. Steel doors, iron bars, rules. Now I realized it was interior. It lived inside your skin. It used your own body as a cage and sat there grinning, waiting to be acknowledged. The cell was no longer around me. It was under me, inside me, becoming me. I ran my fingers across the cinder block, rough and crumbling at the edges, but beneath the texture I felt a heartbeat, not fast, not slow, just steady, like mine. And when I pulled my hand away, the faintest residue of warmth remained on my fingertips. I held them up to the dim ceiling light, trembling. They looked normal, nails chipped, skin pale, but I could still feel the echo of contact. It made me nauseous. It made me strangely calm. The wall was listening. I began to whisper things to it, not because I believed it could hear me, but because I needed to remember how sound worked. My voice had become foreign to me, not the tone or the pitch, but the very idea of it. There had been days, maybe weeks, where I hadn't spoken a single word. I had memorized every scratch in the concrete, every bolt in the door, every crack in the metal sink, but I had forgotten the shape of language, so I told the wall things I couldn't tell myself. I recited memories, my mother's perfume, the sound of tires on wet asphalt, The dull ache behind my eyes when I used to stay up all night writing financial reports I knew no one would read. I spoke of old dresses I once owned, of the way velvet felt against my thighs, of the shimmer of heels under fluorescent lights in downtown elevators. I spoke of silence, not this kind, but the kind that followed laughter at a dinner table, the silence of being full, the silence of belonging. And then the wall responded, not in words, but in temperature, in breath. The air changed subtly, curling against my neck like the exhale of a sleeping animal. I closed my eyes, not out of fear, but something closer to reverence. I wanted to be absorbed. I wanted to press my entire body against that wall and vanish into its porous surface. Let the skin accept mine. Let the bones behind it find mine. I didn't dream much in solitary. Sleep came like a punishment, never a relief. But during one night, if night is the right word in a place without sun or stars, I drifted into a feverish half-consciousness. In that state, I dreamt I was walking barefoot down a hallway made entirely of skin. The floor beneath me was soft and living. Veins pulsed in the walls. Eyelashes grew from the corners. The ceiling sagged slightly, as though breathing above me. I was not afraid. I felt known. In the center of the hallway, a door grew from the flesh. It had no handle, only a mouth. I leaned close. It whispered one word, over and over. Stay. When I awoke, I found myself sitting upright on the bed, knees pulled tight to my chest, nails dug into my arms so deeply I had left half moons in the skin. The walls were still. The stain remained, but the air smelled faintly metallic, like blood warming on a radiator. I tasted salt on my tongue and realized I'd been crying in my sleep. The human body was never meant to be alone for so long. Without mirrors, you forget your face. Without voices, you forget your name. Without touch, you begin to decay, not visibly, but molecularly, spiritually. The decay sets in like rot beneath wallpaper. Slow, sure, irreversible. I counted my bones by feel, ran my hands down my legs, across my ribs, over the notch of my collar. I needed proof I was still singular, that I hadn't melted into the architecture entirely, that my body was still a boundary. But the wall watched. I knew it. I could feel its attention like pressure behind my eyes. It wasn't malicious. It wasn't even sentient. It was simply there, as much a witness as a container, like skin stretched too tightly over muscle, like memory you can't unremember, like guilt that settles in and forgets how to leave. That day, I pressed my forehead to the cool concrete and exhaled for what felt like the first time in years. The wall did not respond. Or maybe it did, but only in silence, its most articulate form of speech. And for a moment, I understood something terrible and true. I was no longer a prisoner in a cell. I was a woman inside a body, and that body had begun to forget where it ended. Time lost its name. I stopped counting the days, not because I no longer cared, but because the numbers turned on me. They became cruel companions, whispering reminders of the hours I would never retrieve. I had drawn hash marks on the wall at first, thin scratches with a broken comb tooth, each one a testament to endurance. But eventually they blurred, overlapped, and dissolved into something meaningless. I no longer knew if I had been there for 30 days or 300. That morning, or what I believed was morning only because the overhead bulb flickered a little longer than usual, I noticed something strange. My hand, lying idle on my thigh, was trembling. not the type of tremor that comes with cold or fear. This was a rhythm, a soft inner pulse that made my fingers twitch, then curl slightly, as if trying to grasp something that wasn't there. I pressed my palm against the cement floor, hoping to steady it. That was when I felt it. Grainy, gritty. Something fine and dry had settled beneath the curve of my lifeline. I lifted my hand. A light dusting of sand clung to my skin. Sand. There was no sand in solitary, no earth, no wind to carry dust from outside. The cell was a vacuum, scrubbed, bleached, lifeless. But in that moment, I saw the particles as clearly as if I were on a beach. A handful of tiny golden specks shimmered against my flesh, each one like a memory returning without warning. And then I remembered the desert. Years ago, before prison, before disgrace, I had taken a trip to Arizona, a silent retreat at a monastery near the edge of the Sonoran border. I had gone not for religion, but for silence. I told everyone it was for clarity, but it was really about escape. On the third day there, I had wandered off the trail during one of the sanctioned walking meditations. The heat was violent, the air thick with dust. I found a flat stone and sat, legs crossed, eyes closed, trying to pretend I was more than a woman in running shoes with a broken mind. And then I opened my palm. Just like that, no purpose, no plan. I let the desert wind fill it with sand. I had stared at that handful for what felt like hours, watching the grains shift with each breath I took. Some lodged into the crease between my fingers. Others fell gently, tumbling back to the earth that birthed them. It felt like proof that something still moved inside me, that I wasn't entirely hollow. And now, years later, in a place where time and terrain had no meaning, the sand had returned. It didn't make sense, and I didn't want it to. I sat on the floor, breathing in the stillness, my hand open like a bowl. The dust remained, unmoving, golden against the gray. I stared so long that the shape of my hand disappeared, leaving only the sand. Memory became smell. I could taste the dry wind. I could hear distant bells from the monastery courtyard, the muffled chant of someone praying in another room. My body responded before my mind did. I shifted into the same pose I had taken years ago. Back straight, ankles tucked, hands resting lightly on my knees, facing upward. A strange peace fell over me. Not joy, not relief, but a temporary truce between myself and the silence. For that hour, I was not locked in. I was not reduced. I was not punished. I was simply there, breathing, sitting, holding something ancient and wild in the curve of my hand. I closed my eyes and waited. At some point, the hallucination, or whatever it was, faded. The air thickened again. The sand disappeared. When I opened my palm once more, it was empty. Just skin, pale, dry, cracked, but different somehow, as if it had touched something real. I stood up slowly, my joints stiff from stillness. My legs protested, but I welcomed the ache. Pain was proof of occupation, of inhabiting a body, of existing. Later, lying on the cot, I pressed both hands flat against my chest. I could feel my heart, slow but steady. I imagined grains of sand traveling through my bloodstream, like messengers from another life, leaving traces of heat and motion in the quiet corridors of my veins. In that moment, I understood something small but significant. Solitary confinement was not just about isolation from others. It was exile from place, from story, from self. The mind, stripped of landmarks, begins to dig. And somewhere in that excavation, if you're lucky or cursed, you find fragments, not of who you were, but of where you once felt alive. That handful of imagined sand reminded me. I had lived. I had stood in sunlight once. I had walked across real ground that burned underfoot. I had closed my eyes and felt something warm fill my hand without asking for it. And now, even in this sealed tomb of metal and stone, that warmth found its way back to me. It didn't save me. Nothing did, but it made the walls less cruel. And for 1 hour, in a place where time no longer spoke, I remembered the sound of wind, and that was enough. The door didn't open with a scream. It groaned low and long, as though reluctant to remember how to move. I didn't stand, not at first. I had almost forgotten the purpose of my legs, how knees bend, how muscles obey when called upon. For days, or weeks, or lifetimes, I had only ever needed to sit, to lie, to tremble. But then it happened. That sound, that mechanical exhale of a lock retracting, a creak, a pause, and the scent of something not mine entered the cell. Soap, dust, leather. A hand gestured. A body stood waiting. I looked at the boots more than the face. Shiny, polished, almost ceremonial. The laces were perfect, a pattern of control. They didn't speak. They never spoke. So I stood. It was like lifting myself from underwater, every limb heavy with memory. My spine unfolded slowly, like an accordion that had been crushed in storage. My feet ached even before they touched the ground properly, and when I tried to step, the soles protested. It was not pain, not exactly. It was surprise. I took one step, then another. The hallway outside was blinding, not because it was bright, but because it was not mine. The cell had become a womb, twisted and cruel, but familiar. Now I had entered something alien. A corridor painted with chipped cream walls, a strip of flickering fluorescence above, faint buzzing, a plastic scent layered over bleach. They walked ahead of me. I followed. And that was when I realized I didn't know how to move forward anymore. I had spent so long walking in circles, imagining tiles, marking invisible borders on concrete. Every step was once a loop, a dance performed for no one in a theater made of gray. Now each step was a breakage, a betrayal of what had kept me sane. We passed other doors. None opened, but I felt the presence behind them, like animals sensing the air shift before a storm. I wanted to knock, not to ask for help, but to remind myself that voices still existed, that breathing was still a communal act. The hallway narrowed, or perhaps I expanded, taking up space I hadn't owned in a while. I could hear my own footsteps echoing. It startled me, sound, mine, unfiltered. I looked down. My shadow walked with me again. A flickering outline on the linoleum floor. It had a head, shoulders, arms, legs. It moved when I moved. It didn't lag behind or stretch unnaturally like the hallucinations on my cell wall. It was obedient, real. The walk ended at a stairwell, an actual staircase. I stared at it like a relic. Steps, real ones, climbing things. I hadn't climbed anything in months, years maybe. My knees didn't agree to the concept immediately. They wobbled. My hands found the railing, cold steel, ribbed for grip, still slick from someone else's palms. The first step was the hardest. The second felt worse. My muscles screamed like they'd been awakened from a coma. Halfway up, I paused, not from fatigue, but from awe. The view from the middle of a staircase is unlike any other place. You're between levels, neither above nor below, neither held nor free. It is a perfect metaphor. I stood there and thought, If I die on these stairs, at least I'll die in transition. A creature not yet returned, but no longer buried. I climbed on. At the top was another hallway. Longer, brighter. A window existed there, a real one. I knew it was real because I could smell it before I saw it. That peculiar scent of aged sunlight filtered through thick glass. It carried the warmth of dust, the heat of silence, the echo of seasons changing. I stopped in front of the window and looked out. The sky was pale, washed out, drained of color like it had been left in bleach. A few trees in the distance clung to the last pieces of fall, tired orange leaves that curled at the edges like old paper. Beyond them, a fence. Beyond the fence, the shape of the world I once knew. Cars, roads, the illusion of speed. And in the middle of all that movement, I stood still. The officer gestured again. This time I followed without thought. My body had begun to remember what it meant to obey signals. A turn, a door, a room. Not solitary, but still a cell. Larger, shared, another bunk, a toilet with no lid, a table bolted to the wall. But it was something else that caught my eye. Color. A bedsheet in pale blue. A plastic cup in lime green. A book with a red cover lying upside down. I touched the sheet. It felt like touching someone else's life. Later, when the other woman arrived, silent, eyes lowered, breath short, I nodded. She didn't nod back. That was fine. I wasn't ready for conversation. I wasn't ready for voice. I sat on the lower bunk, legs dangling, feet finally finding ground. I looked at my hands. They had changed. Thinner, paler, veins like rivers without water. But they were mine, and they trembled not from fear, but from the shock of return. I thought about the last step I had taken in that stairwell, how each rise had felt like reclaiming inches of myself. The muscles, the memory, the motion, the motion. In the quiet of that shared cell, I whispered the number 6. 6 steps, 6 hours, 6 days, 6 years. It didn't matter. What mattered was that I had taken steps backward, out of the silence, out of the concrete, out of the circle I had walked for so long that it nearly became my grave. And now I stood again, uneven, unfinished, uncertain, but standing nonetheless. That was how it began, not with redemption, but with one foot, then the other, remembering how to leave a room without leaving myself behind.